Welcome to another deep dive with us. This time we're looking at the crisis unfolding in Gaza, trying to really break down what just happened, why this sudden surge in violence. We're going to be mainly focusing on a BBC News report that just came out, gives us like those immediate reactions and, boots on the ground reporting from the region. It's just chaos, just utterly heartbreaking. And honestly, it's hard to even know where to start with all of this.
Well, I think what really jumps out, at least initially, is just these two completely different narratives about what even caused the ceasefire to fall apart.
Yeah, that's true. Hamas is saying Israel broke the agreement, but Israel is saying that Hamas refused to even consider extending it and wouldn't release the hostages. So, I mean, how do we unpack all of this? It feels like it's a lot more complicated than just like he said, she said, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. You can't ignore the history here. I mean, there's just this deep-seated mistrust on both sides. Each side interprets everything the other does through this lens of, like, past betrayals, broken promises. It's a lot. You throw in external forces, each with their own agendas. Well, finding any common ground is almost impossible.
Okay, so broken trust is a huge factor. But let's get into what's happening right now, like on the ground. The BBC report calls these Israeli airstrikes extensive, hitting several cities all across Gaza. The death toll, it's just horrifying. Over 400 people reported killed by the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry, including a high-ranking Hamas official, and hundreds more injured. They even show footage from the Indonesian hospital, and it's just absolutely devastating.
And it's vital to remember that these strikes come after years of blockades and restrictions in Gaza, creating a humanitarian crisis before this even started.
Yeah.
Food, fuel, water, all desperately short beforehand. Now it's almost unthinkable.
And the timing, it couldn't be worse. I mean, it's Ramadan, a time for families to be together, to break their fast, and instead they're, terrified, wondering if their home will be next.
Really underscores how conflict just disrupts everything, even those most sacred traditions. The BBC actually spoke to Ghada Uda, a freelance journalist in Gaza City, and what she says paints a very grim picture. She talks about this feeling of being trapped, of having no freedom, living constantly under the threat of war.
Her story's so powerful because it gives a voice to those everyday people caught in the middle of this. They're not political pawns. They're just individuals. They have families, they have hopes, they have dreams, dreams that are being completely shattered by this violence.
One thing that stood out to me was that some of the Hamas officials killed in the strikes were actually from the political wing, not the military wing.
Oh, and why is that significant?
Well, it might suggest that Israel's aim is to dismantle Hamas's ability to govern, not just their military capabilities. And if that's true, that raises a lot of questions about what happens to Gaza next. Who steps in if Hamas can't govern? And what does that mean for future peace efforts?
And what's Israel's justification for this level of force?
Their foreign minister defended the strikes, saying they were a necessary response to what Hamas did, and, they're rejecting the ceasefire proposals. They also put the blame squarely on Hamas for what's happening to the hostages.
It's just hard to see a way out, a path toward de-escalation when both sides are so dug in, right? The BBC report mentions reactions from other countries like Iran and Jordan. They're condemning the strikes, and the EU is calling for de-escalation, but is anyone actually listening?
That's the big question. Professor Yossi Meckelberg, he's a fellow at Chatham House, that's a well-known think tank. He believes Israel's basically given up on getting the hostages back and is now focused on just undermining Hamas's authority.
So you're saying he thinks it's about more than just rescuing the hostages, but actually weakening Hamas's control over Gaza.
That's his take. And it leads to another critical question. Who's going to be there to negotiate future ceasefires or even handle rebuilding efforts if Hamas is gone?
It's like we're sinking deeper and deeper into this conflict, and there's just no way out in sight. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. And honestly, we've only just scratched the surface here. It's easy to get caught up in like the right now of it all, but I think it's really important to step back and think about, the bigger picture here. One thing we haven't really talked about is the role of the media and information and how that shapes our understanding of this conflict.
That's a really good point. I mean, we're just flooded with headlines and images and videos from everywhere. It's hard to even know what to believe. Even this BBC report talks about how hard it is to verify information coming out of Gaza, especially with all this conflicting footage online.
Right. They even show us how their team uses those reverse image search tools to figure out if the videos and photos are actually new or if they're from like older events. It's a good reminder that we got to be careful. We got to be critical about what we're seeing, especially in these these chaotic situations.
Oh, absolutely. We can't just take everything at face value, right? We got to question the sources, look at different viewpoints, be really careful about that misinformation because it just spreads like wildfire in these situations.
And don't forget, everything, every piece of information, every image, every story, it's all coming from somewhere, right? It's filtered through a specific lens, a specific perspective. So whether it's from Hamas or Israel or some international news outlet, there's always an angle, a narrative they're pushing.
So how do we navigate this crazy information landscape? How do we even begin to get a clear picture of what's really happening in Gaza?
Well, it's about looking for those diverse sources, comparing different accounts and trying to find that evidence-based reporting. It's also about, you know, being honest with ourselves about our own biases and how that might affect how we see things.
Right, because we all come at this with our own ideas and beliefs, and we have to be mindful of how that shapes our understanding of the conflict.
And being open, you know, open to listening to perspectives that challenge our own assumptions. Even if we disagree with what someone's saying, it's still important to try and understand where they're coming from, why they believe what they believe.
That's critical thinking, right? Really engaging with different points of view, even ones we might be uncomfortable with, to get a more complete picture of the situation.
Exactly. And it's through that kind of understanding, that deeper understanding, that we can start to build empathy, and work towards real dialogue and maybe even solutions.
Speaking of that deeper understanding, there was something else in the BBC report I wanted to come back to. The fact that these strikes happened at the same time as Prime Minister Netanyahu was supposed to be in court for his corruption trial. And there's that whole thing about him maybe firing the head of Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service.
Ah, yes. That timing does raise some eyebrows, doesn't it? It makes you wonder if there were some other political motivations at play here. Was this a way to distract from problems at home or to solidify his power?
Well, it's always important to consider the wider political context, right? Actions on the world stage often have consequences at home, and vice versa.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that these things aren't happening in isolation. It's all connected, internal and external factors all mixed up. And if you want to grasp the bigger picture, you got to understand those connections.
It's easy to get lost in all that political strategy stuff, but at the end of the day, we can't forget about the people at the center of all of this. I keep thinking about Ghada Uda, that journalist, what it must be like to live with that constant fear, that uncertainty.
Her story is so powerful, so important. It reminds us of the human cost of this conflict. We get caught up in headlines and speeches, but we need to remember there are real people whose lives are being shattered. They are the ones paying the price, and their stories need to be heard.
And what struck me about her was, her resilience. Even in the face of such hardship, she's still trying to keep things normal. She still has hope.
It's a reminder of the power of the human spirit. Even in the darkest moments, people find ways to cope, to connect, to have faith in a better future.
But we can't let that hope be mistaken for acceptance, right? Things in Gaza are terrible, and the world needs to do more than just talk. They need to take action to stop things from getting worse and to protect those civilians.
The EU is calling for de-escalation, yeah, but words aren't enough. We need action, sending aid, getting those parties talking, working towards a just and lasting peace. That's how you make a real difference.
That's a huge task, but it's the only way to a future where, Israelis and Palestinians can live together in peace.
And that future starts by acknowledging the suffering on both sides, listening to their stories, and understanding how complicated this conflict really is.
It's about realizing there's no easy answer, no quick fix. It's about committing to the hard work of peace building, even when it feels impossible.
Because the alternative, more violence, more suffering, another generation trapped in this cycle, it's unthinkable.
We cannot let that happen. We owe it to the people of Gaza, to the people of Israel, to ourselves, to fight for something better.
A future where hope wins, where peace is stronger than conflict.
Wow, it feels like we've gone through so much in this deep dive, but it's also pretty clear that we've only just scratched the surface when it comes to understanding this conflict in Gaza.
You're absolutely right, and I think that's one of the most important things for our listeners to take away from this. Don't just forget about this when it's not on the news. What's happening in Gaza is changing all the time, and it needs our attention, it needs our focus.
So where do we even go from here? What can our listeners do, knowing everything we've talked about?
First things first, stay informed. Keep looking for those trustworthy sources of information, and be careful about all that misinformation and propaganda that's out there. Remember, there are so many different perspectives on this conflict, and it's important to consider them all.
Yeah, I think it's also really important to question what we believe, that these biases we all have, it's so easy to think we have it all figured out. But the reality is this conflict is incredibly complicated.
And don't be afraid to talk to people who see things differently than you do. Listen to them. Try to understand their point of view. You might not agree with them, but having those conversations is so important. It's how we build empathy and find some common ground.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this and think, what can I do? I'm just one person. But I think we have to believe that even small actions can make a difference.
Absolutely. There are so many things you can do. Donate to those humanitarian organizations working in Gaza, write to your elected officials and tell them you want a peaceful solution, or even just share information about what's going on social media. Every little bit helps.
And maybe the most important thing is just to remember the human cost of all of this. You know, behind the headlines and the political stuff are real people whose lives are being completely torn apart.
We can't let ourselves get used to the suffering. We have to keep reminding ourselves that these aren't just numbers. They're people with families, with hopes, with dreams.
This deep dive into what's happening in Gaza has been tough, there's no doubt about that. But it's been a really important reminder of how fragile peace is and how much we need a solution to this conflict, a solution that's just and that lasts.
It's a conflict that needs our attention, it needs our empathy, and it needs us to be committed to finding a peaceful way forward.
And with that, we leave you to continue exploring this complex issue on your own. Keep asking questions, keep challenging what you think you know, and keep working towards a world where peace is stronger than conflict.
Until next time, keep diving deep.